Well, members, 599 pages. We are here, well, now less than an hour and a half before the end of session. We got this maybe 3 hours before the end of session, 3.5. Once again, we're ramming through $500 million in new spending in 9 different budget areas with a bill we got 3.5 hours ago. One of the themes of this bill, I think, members, is great expectations that have been crushed. We came into this biennium two decades ago, or 2 years ago. Sorry, it's late. Feels like 2 decades. Yeah. With lots of expectations, lots of promises about what we were going to accomplish for the people of Minnesota, lots of promises about what we accomplished for greater Minnesota, lots of promises that we are going to accomplish for ordinary Minnesotans. And what did we find? Well, for 2 years, we, the House Democrats, have been fighting for those ordinary Minnesotans. People who work hard every day, but know that this economy is tilted against them. We've been fighting for working parents that are forced to choose to stay at home with a sick kid or lose their paycheck. We're fighting for students who are working hard to get ahead only to be confronted by crushing debt. Students who saw a tuition hike this year in Representative Knobloch's district, despite the state having a $2 billion surplus. We've been fighting for seniors on fixed incomes who barely can afford the cost of skyrocketing prescription drugs, ideas that we brought forward this year that didn't even get a hearing in the State House of Representatives. These Minnesotans are rightly frustrated. The cards are stacked against them, and what is this legislature doing about it? On these bread and butter economic issues facing Minnesotans, the Republicans have, for the most part, done nothing. You didn't come up with any new ideas. All you did was protect the status quo and protect well-connected special interest allies. Think back to last year, permanent tax breaks for the owners of skyscrapers instead of economic relief for ordinary Minnesotans. $15 in tax breaks for every dollar you put towards schools. Protecting wealthy railroad companies at the expense of the safety of hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans who live along those oil routes. Blocking campaign finance reform at every turn, putting your thumb in the eye of Minnesotans who are desperate to have their voice heard in this process instead of the special interests whispering in Republican ears. And again today, a big tax break for big tobacco. You chose big tobacco over giving relief to seniors on Social Security. That captures what this Republican majority has done for the last 2 years. That is shameful. Now, there were some modest victories, but they're modest victories that Governor Dayton and the Senate Democrats dragged you kicking and screaming to do, including investments in education. If we look at this bill, St. Peter and Anoka, perhaps the biggest public safety issue that we face in this state, immediate needs to keep our workers safe, to keep the patients in those facilities safe. You couldn't even find the money to fund that. Cybersecurity. There are people across the state who understand that their data, and there's lots of data being held by the state of Minnesota, is at risk. They see it happening every day at big companies, at Target, at Barnes & Noble. We see this happening all the time. Yet you couldn't find it in a $900 million surplus this year to put any money to protect the state from cybersecurity. We saw Representative Dean for years now, Representative Hamilton for years now standing up. Not 1%, not 2%, not 3%, 5%. The 5% campaign, you've done nothing about that. Your words are increasingly ringing hollower and hollower. We have these new overtime rules. You couldn't even find the money to actually cover the cost of that. We have these people that are working incredibly hard, caring for our loved ones, and you couldn't find in a $900 million surplus, not only just a $900 million surplus, more than that, because you borrowed money from the Healthcare Access Fund. You borrowed money from schools that can't even repay the loans, and now you're going to have to give them $11 million so you can find your $53 million. More than $900 million surplus. You couldn't find the money to do the 5% campaign, or even give a little bit of money to cover the cost of overtime. Again, this is shameful. Higher education. Crushing student debt. We have all heard about this issue. You gave a zero target to your higher ed chair. We have nearly zero money in this final bill at your insistence. You're not willing to support one of the fundamental institutions in this state, one of our primary economic engines, which is the University of Minnesota. It's the place where we have innovation happen for our state. If we want to compete in a global economy, the thing that we can do is actually have the strongest university possible. But the bottom line is, because you have some ideological tiff, because Representative Knobloch has some ideological tiff with the University of Minnesota, he was not willing to put a single dime toward the University of Minnesota. His personal animosity toward the university means that they're getting no money. That's not the way we should be doing lawmaking in the state of Minnesota. Childcare, Representative Franzen traveled around the state listening to childcare providers. And what's the best we could come up with? A task force to study something more when we already know the answer. They're not being paid enough because we don't support those folks that are providing those services enough. And families are being priced out of the market because we're unwilling to actually provide support to ordinary families to help them afford their child care. The answer is easy. The fact is, you just don't want to spend money to help ordinary families because you want to give $35 million to big tobacco. Broadband, a fundamental failure. We know the need is much more significant out there, but again, you were unwilling to put the money into that. So members, we're here again with a sad situation after 11 weeks of being together. You stood with corporate special interests to block family leave, perhaps the best thing we could do to help Minnesota families. You stood with corporate special interests to block campaign finance reform, continuing to drown out the voices of Minnesotans. And worst of all, we are blocking out in this body tonight the voices of those Minnesotans because you couldn't get your work done on time. We're standing here an hour and 15 minutes before the end of session after having a reasonable debate, not getting many of our questions answered. We need to change this, members. The lack of transparency, the lack of openness, the behind the closed doors deals that everybody was so frustrated with last year, we are right back here once again. We brought forward some ideas this year that I thought might be taken seriously after the debacle of the end of last year's session. Why don't we say we should all get 24 hours with a bill in front of us so that we can actually review it, so the people of Minnesota can review it, so our constituents can review it? You know what the House Republican majority said? No, we don't need to give people 24 hours. We should be able to just trust us. And the reason you don't want to give 24 hours is because you actually don't want people to read what's in your bills, I think is the point. So what's next? I think that's going to be the questions before Minnesotans in the coming months. We know what the Republican vision for the state of Minnesota is. The Republican vision for the state of Minnesota is to look backwards, to defend the status quo, to protect those well-connected special interests who have your ear walking up and down the corridors of these halls. Our vision for the state of Minnesota, to get corporate tax cuts, to big tobacco, to owners of skyscrapers, instead of investing in education, instead of helping people with living on Social Security, instead of helping people with their property taxes. Our vision for Minnesota is actually to help ordinary Minnesotans, to look to the future, to invest in innovation at places like the University of Minnesota, to make sure people can actually afford child care, the 5th highest in the country, that people can actually afford to pursue a higher education, that people can actually get a good K-12 education in the state, that people can actually afford their health care, that people can afford their prescription drugs. You have ignored all of that. There might be some good things in this budget. Frankly, I don't know everything that's in this budget because we have 599 pages that we got less than 3 hours ago. This is not how we should run this state of Minnesota. This is not the kind of approach we should take to building for our future. You're locked in the status quo. The Republicans are locked in the status quo. They're beholden to their corporate special interest friends, as they demonstrated over and over again. It's time for a change. This bill is not that. Members, I urge you to vote no.
Gentleman from Sherburne, Chairman Knobloch.
Well, Mr. Chair, just quickly correcting the record on a couple of things. You know, we've been meeting in public for 2 weeks on this conference committee. We've taken lots of testimony, had lots of public meetings. It's not true there's no funding for cybersecurity. There's $2 million. If you look at line 40 on the state government finance spreadsheet, it's not true there's no fraud funding for the Department of Revenue. There's money, I think it's around $1 million on that same spreadsheet. But members, the hour is late. I do want to recognize Representative Heinzman, who was also really involved in the veterans tax benefit issue here. Is actually a lot of language from his bill that we're actually proposing in this particular bill. But members, as you think about how you're going to vote on this bill, you know, if you don't want to give veterans the tax credit, well, then go ahead and vote no. If you don't want to give a tax credit to parents of stillborn children, well, go ahead and vote no. If you don't want to put more money into this bill to give the Department of Human Services the money they need to lock up sex offenders, well, then go ahead and vote no. If you don't want to have more money for the crisis we do have with mentally ill and not having enough beds, well, then go ahead and vote no. If you don't want to provide the money we need for the widows and orphans of police and peace officers who have been killed in the line of duty that we're funding in this bill, then go ahead and vote no. And if you don't like kids playing hockey, vote no too. Members, there's a lot of great things in this bill. Please vote yes. Let's get her done.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 95 ayes and 39 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by conference and its title agreed to.